Okay, thank you for joining us today. So today I'm going to talk about the loss of expectations, which is kind of another side of grief that we don't always address. And I'll talk about that throughout the presentation. Um, my name is Selena Morezzi. And I'm so glad that you're joining us today. This is a topic that I really, if you can enjoy talking about a topic like this, I really do enjoy talking about it. I enjoy sharing information about this. I think it's a really valuable topic. I have a background, just a little bit about me. I have a background in psychology as well as public health. I've been teaching at Westchester University for 10 years now, specifically a class on death and dying. But I've also had the pleasure of working at Caron treatment centers since 2014. I'm their lead student assisted specialist for Pennsylvania, and I focus primarily actually on a lot of nicotine prevention and cessation work, as well as THC interventions, and a lot of other different areas that I get to do at Caron. But this is also one of them. I get to talk about some of our background and sharing information around grief for families and for students. So I feel really lucky that I get to do that in my role. So what I'm going to talk about today is probably a little different than some of the other presentations I do, where I focus so much on grief related to death, right? This is a little different. I love that we are exploring this topic, because we grieve in so many different ways, right? And this is kind of some questions for you to think about as we move through the presentation. But the idea of, like, have you ever actually mourned for someone sitting in front of you? Have you ever grieved for a person you thought they would become, right? And grief really isn't reserved solely for death. It can manifest when you feel the loss of someone's potential, or someone's path, or what you believe they should have become, right? Such grief can be isolating. It can go unnoticed without that sort of general gestures of condolence and support from others. It can feel silent and not necessarily something that is often spoken about. So again, I'm really glad that we're actually talking about this topic today. So how do we grieve? I'm going to start kind of off with some of the more traditional views of grief, and talking about the grief process itself. And then I'm going to move into sort of the more general, like, idea around grieving the loss of expectations, not necessarily someone's death. But in general, I think this is a really inclusive definition of grief, and it's grief defined by the Grief Recovery Institute. And it's the idea that grief is described as the conflicting feelings caused by the end or the change in a familiar pattern of behavior. And this is a thought-provoking definition, because this is more broad, it is more general. It's the idea that grief doesn't always, it's not always associated with death, right? It's a complex emotion. And it's triggered by various situations. And when we think about it in general, that this definition specifically actually highlights the fact that even changes in familiar behavior patterns can evoke the feeling of grief. They can be things like we move, we end a relationship changes, we change jobs, retirement, adjusting to any kind of new lifestyle can actually cause grief. And we don't always acknowledge that, right? Um, Understanding that this sort of broadened perspective on grief can help us recognize and address feelings associated with it. We can name it. We can understand that this is grief that we're feeling. And it emphasizes the importance of really acknowledging those emotions, regardless of their source, even if we don't necessarily feel like we normally associate grief with this change or this event. I think, a lot of times too, when we think about grief, we think about the traditional view of grief. Sometimes the idea of bereavement comes to mind. And bereavement really refers to sort of the duration of sorrow following a death. And so this is almost like a time frame, right? We often hesitate to put a time frame on how long you're supposed to feel grief. But bereavement is generally what we think of when we think of that period of time after a death or a loss. It's the phase, if you will, that we sort of attempt to understand the repercussions of this loss, it's a period to potentially reshape our inner bond with the departed. I always liked this concept because we still have a relationship with that person. It's not necessarily an interactive relationship, but it's a relationship that we can redefine, we can remember, we can acknowledge and honor that person as we continue to live. So it's adjusting to this new reality and this new bond that we have with the person who has died. And it's a moment to think about strategies on how we can quote unquote move on. And like I said, we tend to sometimes put pressure on ourselves or those around us to move on from a loss. So I put that in quotations, but that's essentially when we think about the traditional ways to grieve, we often think of bereavement and we think of mourning. And mourning is interesting because what it is the process of incorporation of the loss into our lives. And it's an outward acknowledgement. It's actually often associated with rituals and events and behavior. Like when we think about back in the Victorian times, there was actually specific periods of time that you were meant to mourn depending on the relationship of the person who died. If it was your husband or your child or your parent, the way you should dress, the way you should behave, should you attend certain events, you should not attend certain events. It's an outward expression that at points in our history, we actually had rules associated with this, right? And social groups defined those rules. They defined what behaviors you were supposed to participate in, and how you were supposed to behave outwardly when you lost someone. So when we think of like the traditional way to look at grief, we often think of bereavement, we think of mourning, we think of outward expression, because it helps us understand it a little bit better because it's been the way it's always been, right? We also have our own experience of grief. And, studies suggest that there's something called acute grief, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but really it's the period of time after the initial loss of someone that we actually feel physical symptoms. We feel psychological symptoms as well, of course, but some of the physical symptoms that we often feel associated with grief aren't always understood clearly, but we can all kind of relate to them, right? Lack of appetite, insomnia, sometimes nightmares or nausea or depression. This is actually an interesting one that I think a lot of people that I've talked to express a lot, this sort of tightness. There's actually frequent sighing because it's hard to breathe sometimes when we're in this acute space. So people sigh in attempts to kind of catch their breath, right? And we feel kind of weak. Some people have also talked about feeling altered in some ways, almost feeling, association with feeling drunk, almost this kind of weakness, clumsiness. And then there's also psychological reactions. And of course, we're not limited to these, but things and events can seem unreal. We can feel detached from what's going on around us. Some people actually report hallucinations, not necessarily really intense hallucinations, just like thinking that they hear that person's voice in the next room. Or if you've lost a pet, thinking you see the pet run across the kitchen. These sort of like brief hallucinations almost. There's tension, anxiety, depression, loneliness, anger. I mean, all of the feelings that we think you should feel, and so many more, right? We're not limited to these. But when we think about sort of the traditional feelings of grief, the traditional symptoms of grief, this is often what we think of. And that acute grief, again, that's the period of time, the immediate aftermath of a loss. This is really the period of time of intense feelings of sadness. We're occupied by anxiety, sometimes bitterness or anger or remorse, guilt or shame. And it's overwhelming. It encompasses a big part of our life, right? I found this, and I thought this is a really nice way to describe acute grief and integrated grief. And acute grief really is what figure 1 looks like in this image. It is all encompassing. It takes up most spaces in our life. It's the immediate aftermath, like that definition said, and it is something that is pretty consuming, right? Integrated grief is really illustrated in figure 2. And this is the idea that we start to adapt. We start to think about moving, what our life is going to look like. We start to have feelings and behaviors that are still associated with the loss, but we start to look at ways that we can honor our loved one, ways that we can remember our loved one, but also ways that we can start to incorporate our lives, our daily lives back into our experience. Grief finds a place. So in figure two, grief is still there. It is still present. It's just not all consuming. So this is kind of what we think of when we think of integrated grief. And that's also why I put moving on in quotes, and I'll reference it a few times. I think a lot of people are really starting to understand that grief doesn't entirely go away. Our life changes and becomes something else around it. We incorporate that loss into our lives, but it is still there. And sometimes, though, we can run into something called complicated grief. And this is really sort of when acute grief endures, where that sense of loss starts to obstruct or get in the way of our path to healing, or our path to still incorporating grief into our life. There's a couple different types of this. Chronic grief is really what the idea that there's this enduring sense of sadness. It's persistent, and it's interfering with our ability to move on and engage in our life again. And it's lasting for an extended period of time. We always hesitate to say what that time frame is, but it's an extended period of time where the person is not necessarily re-engaging in their life. Sometimes with complicated grief, we can see a delay. And this is sometimes when reactions, grief reactions are held back, whether that's intentional or unintentional, to try to avoid the pain, the sorrow associated with grief. This can actually result in exaggerated grief, the idea that we can actually turn grief inwards and become harmful to ourselves, engaging in potential self-harm or even potential suicidal ideations. And then there's masked grief, where the person doesn't actually recognize that maybe their disruptive behavior is actually associated with the grief or the loss that they feel. So these are just some ideas or some types of complicated grief. When that integration that we saw before in those images isn't going as smoothly as we had hoped. Sometimes too, we can have a cumulative experience of grief, and this can go with any kind of loss, right? And I think many of us can relate to this. And it's what happens when we have a loss that occurs, but then there's additional losses that maybe we anticipated, maybe we didn't anticipate, that come after that initial loss. And that can be very complicated, and that can be very overwhelming. It's a cumulative effect, right? I found and I'll share a couple of images and clips from my website called What's Your Grief, and I'll give you the information at the end. I think it's just a really great resource, because it's a grief website that not only focuses on death, the grief that we experience because of a death, but it's also because of all of the types of grief. So it's very inclusive. So I'll share some things throughout. But this particular quote references that cumulative effect, the secondary losses that we feel. Because after we experience a devastating loss, we're always often surprised to find that ripple effect that occurs. The primary cause has these other shifts, these other like kind of domino effects that affect maybe our finances or our relationships with friends or community. They can affect our faith, our sense of self, and it can continue to go on. And it's really almost a snowball effect in some cases, where we have that initial trauma and all of where we don't necessarily know or anticipate what could happen next, but our world, in acute grief is turned upside down. But there's also these secondary effects, right? They can be our changes to our routine, changes to what we thought our goals, our plans are for ourselves, our family, or other people, right? A sense of security we could feel vulnerable in this space. Secondary losses can be surprising and make us feel pretty vulnerable. We can question our faith or our belief system. We can not necessarily feel like we have a support system. We can feel that our social connections failed us, right? Loss of hope for the future, potentially, loss of goals and dreams that involve a person or ourselves, loss of sense of the life that maybe we shared with that person or the life that we shared with our families. I once talked to somebody who explained something called the little funerals, and I thought this was a really accurate description. And she was describing to me that she had lost someone, and they always insisted on this kind of hand soap that they wanted to use. And she had used up the final bit of the hand soap that she had purchased while this person was still alive. And she felt completely overwhelmed with sadness. And she really referred to that as little funerals. And we have a lot of them. Those are the sort of the secondary things that we don't anticipate that can keep happening over a period of time. So that's kind of some of the traditional ways that we think of when we think of grief. But how do we grieve? And it's a pretty unique experience. Kubler-Ross, who I think many of us can remember or talk about or even reference, right? She had the 5 stages of grief, and the idea that when we initially hear the news, we experience shock, potentially denial, we bargain, we feel anger, we feel depression and acceptance. But what some people don't know is that Kubler-Ross's original research was actually with terminally ill patients. These stages were really meant to get to be the reaction that people get when they receive the news that they themselves have received a terminal diagnosis. And although it's been used many times in grief for the loss of a person, and it can be appropriate, it puts pressure on people to feel that their grief should be linear, that you should follow these very strict steps, and that you should get to acceptance and move on with your life, and that should all be done in the time frame that your work gives you, that's 4 days. And there's a lot of pressure associated with these stages of grief. And some people might experience emotions like these. Some people might experience very different emotions. You might not feel some of these emotions, and reaching acceptance doesn't necessarily mean that grief is gone or fully resolved. And not everyone's grief journey is the same. It's very unique. So there's no right way to grieve. So Kubler-Ross was brilliant and doing this work before anyone else really was. So, but it's sometimes misinterpreted. Her work is sometimes misinterpreted. So it's important to note that it was really for terminally ill patients initially. A model that can be helpful in understanding sort of the natural process is the dual process model. And it's the idea that we have a sort of loss-oriented and restoration-oriented way of being, and that we oscillate between the two, and that we can do that within a day, we can do that within weeks or months or even minutes. There's no set formula. We can accept the reality and the finality of the loss in that loss-oriented space. In the restoration-oriented space, we can start to adjust to new relationships, the dynamic, again, with the person that we've lost, or the person that we are grieving that isn't yet dead, or is not dead at all. Or we start to re-engage in our life. We start to envision a future with purpose and the potential for joy in restoration-oriented. And we can oscillate between these two spaces. Like I said, within a day, something can happen and put us back into loss-oriented. And then hours later, we can go back. There's no formula, there's no clear way, but it gives us space to understand that we can go back and forth. And it gives us the sort of the grace to be allowed to do that. So with all that being said, the focus of this webinar is really on the loss of expectations. And that has more to do with non-death losses associated with grief than the kind we experience when we have a death. So grief can occur from the loss of anything that carries significant attachment. So like we referenced before, it can be events, it can be moves, it can be changes in relationship, loss of relationship. In non-death loss, a person can grieve the loss of anything significant to their physical, psychological, spiritual, and interpersonal lives throughout a person's life They will experience many non-death losses. Some will feel minor and manageable, while other losses will feel devastating and life-altering. And Mark Twain really emphasized the fact that nothing that grieves us can be called little. By the external laws of proportion, a child's loss of a doll and a king's loss of a crown are events of the same size. So we, again, not trying not to judge our reaction or our experience. Disenfranchised grief is kind of what he was referring to. And this is the idea that grief isn't solely the result of a death. People can experience grief from numerous situations and life events. And circumstances that we maybe initially overlooked can profoundly affect someone else's experience. So the importance of not putting, the idea of the doll versus the crown, putting judgment on it, right? Because someone else's experience might be very profound to them. And specifically with disenfranchised grief, there's sometimes stigma around the grief, and sometimes the idea, like we go back to mourning and how that's defined by society. Disenfranchised grief isn't always recognized by our community. So it actually can really cause a lot of loneliness because the grief that we're feeling isn't acknowledged. And disenfranchised grief is really a sorrow that is not widely recognized, accepted, or publicly expressed. And this loss can sometimes carry social stigma. So it can be that your loved one is suffering with substance use disorder. They are not on the path that you thought or had hoped they would be on. They receive a diagnosis. A relationship ends. There's many things that are, someone is incarcerated. There's many societal stigmas associated with real loss that we experience, but others don't necessarily know how to deal with because there's stigma associated with it. Cultural norms may even invalidate or minimize our right or someone's right to experience or mourn when it comes to disenfranchised grief because it's not traditional. And society frequently kind of says, well, they deem what is acceptable and what is unacceptable when it comes to grief, because we always have had that sort of historic way on how we define mourning and how we define what is acceptable. And disenfranchised grief and something called non-finite grief, which I'll talk about in a moment, does lack a lot of research associated with the effects of family. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So there's some research, although it is limited, there's some research on the effect of disenfranchised grief, specifically on families who have individuals that are loved ones who are incarcerated. So their experience falls out of that kind of conventional grieving norms that we see. So such families really, they experience what we would define as disenfranchised grief, and they experience loss and they experience sadness over loss of aspirations and dreams and expectations that they held for their loved one. But again, not always engaged or understood, not always acknowledged, because there's a stigma attached with it. And also there's not a lot of understanding around this kind of grief. It goes unrecognized. And because when we have a death, there's really clear associated rituals to comfort someone when they're grieving. We don't always do a good job with that either, but they exist, right? Disenfranchised grief lacks that kind of support. And there's not really bereavement leave or condolence cards for this kind of loss. People don't know what to do. People don't know how to help. People don't know how to address it. Sometimes they'll say things like, well, at least they're not dead, or they really clearly misunderstand how intense this kind of loss can feel. And this kind of grief really does rearrange your address book, right? People act in unexpected ways. Those around us, those that we go to, our friends, our support system, our community, acts in unexpected ways. People that maybe you assumed would understand or would lend support might not. And sometimes people don't know what to say, so they will not address this. They will not say anything. They'll remain silent, and that feels very lonely as well, right? And some other aspects of that kind of non-death grief, and I'll talk about them in a moment, that non-finite grief that I refer to. I'm going to talk about intangible and tangible losses, as well as chronic sorrow and ambiguous loss. And when we think of loss, when we think of grief, we traditionally think of tangible losses. These are visible, easily understood, such as a death or even a loss of a home or a job or a relationship, right? But there's intangible losses. And this is something that is less likely, or you can't easily observe this. And these are losses of our hopes, our ideals, the shattered belief in which we thought what should have been, what might have been, and so forth, and what is now not. Non-finite loss is that persistent grief that arises after this occurs, right? After our life is not lining up with what our expectations of it, or our loved one's life is not lining up with what our expectations were of their life. It often surfaces when we have someone who is experiencing an illness, significant life change, substance use disorder, serious mental illness diagnosis. This is the kind of that non-finite loss is specifically kind of what we're feeling. And there's a painful gap between our aspirations and the actual circumstances that we're seeing in front of us. And that's where that loss lives. That's where that sadness lives. And, from childhood, we have ideas, what we imagined, right? And we all have this, we all make choices to move towards that. But sometimes, these things can become out of our control when we don't have the child or the partner or the job that we want. But it's even deeper. It can be when our hopes are dashed, when things go very wrong, when someone is sick or struggling. Non-finite grief is grieving the life that you imagined or expected. And again, these are from What's Your Grief, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But non-finite grief is when the life you're living doesn't align with the life you imagined. And from an early age, we identify what is good, what is bad. We're taught this. We see this all around us. What is success? What is family? What is happiness? What is failure? What is normal? What is abnormal? And on and on and on. And we build our lives on this base, on the structure of what all of this should be. And sometimes we have an event. We have something that occurs. An injury, an illness, a divorce, infertility, a death, addiction, incarceration, foster care. There's so many things that can happen that change, that rock that foundation, that change what we thought we had. And though the life you're living may still have joy, it has value, it has meaning. You often hear people say, what about your other children? Or what about, and all of these things, you can have gratitude and sadness in the same space. All of these things are true. But there can always be a sense of loss around what you thought was going to be the life that you were living. And those are features of non-finite grief, right? That ongoing uncertainty regarding what lies ahead. It's a sense of disconnection of what we thought that sort of normal, quote unquote, normal human experience was going to be for us, what our journey was going to be. And it's profound. I mean, this kind of loss is frequently underestimated or even potentially ignored by others, but it can be life-changing for the person that's experiencing it. It's a sense of powerlessness, loss of control, and there's so many, and it can make you question all these other aspects of your life. When we receive sort of this kind of news, whatever that is, if it's an event or a series of events, we have to sometimes, our life is irrevocably changed. Sorry, I have a hard time with that word. And we have to look at what this new normal is. The life that follows doesn't look the way that we thought. We often don't even think about how these events would impact us until they do, because we know what we want. Many of us know what we want. We have a sort of things that we're moving towards, goals that we're moving towards. So we don't always consider that these sorts of events, these diagnoses or events are going to happen, so they can be shocking as well. And the new normal that we now are experiencing makes us feel potentially unprepared or vulnerable. And the map that we laid out, all these choices that we made, doesn't seem like it's helpful now because we don't know where to move forward. And sometimes that can lead to a sense of overwhelming sort of chronic sorrow. And that's when we have this experience, this loss. And like we talked about before, that snowball effect, there's secondary losses associated with it. We can sometimes think of these as living losses. We can have someone in front of us that's still alive, that's still with us, but they continue to struggle. And so there's continuing losses associated with their struggle. It can be ongoing. It can be related to a specific event, or it can be a series of events. But it's something that keeps going. It makes us also feel pretty vulnerable because it can dash our hopes. And it can be something that we can't predict anymore. And chronic sorrow, also associated with kind of that disenfranchised grief, it can be emotional disturbances. It can be withdrawal from, it can lead us to withdraw from society because people don't understand that disenfranchised grief. Again, people don't know what to say to us. They don't know how to relate to this sometimes. And then it can also cause a lot of different problems. It can cause psychosomatic problems. We can actually have physical illnesses ourselves and low self-esteem. And just kind of the difference, like sometimes you'll hear people say, well, maybe you're depressed. And yeah, this can lead to depression, but chronic sorrow can be a little bit different than depression. And depression is more of a mood disturbance that can, it looks like lack of energy. It looks like maybe not engaging in what we were engaging in before. But chronic sorrow can be also that lack of energy or exhaustion. But it's associated, this sort of ongoing, it's because of this ongoing need to cope with these things that are coming in. Depression are symptoms that, we can't always figure out exactly if there was a definitive source that caused this. But with chronic sorrow, there is a definitive source. We kind of understand that maybe it's because of this person's diagnosis or their substance use disorder, or whatever that is, their accident, there's sort of the starting point, right? With depression, it can be temporary and improve over time. With chronic sorrow, it typically lasts as long as that sort of loss or what we're dealing with is present. However, there are things that we can do to help relieve some of that. With depression, it can be responsive to medication. With chronic sorrow, unless depression results, medication isn't always needed. It's because it's more situational than it is an overall depression. And that ambiguous loss is part of the reason why we feel that. An ambiguous loss happens when you're grieving someone who is still living. The difference than the grief you experience when someone dies is very finite and certain. And there's no question that you feel pain because of that. Whereas ambiguous loss happens because when someone or something is profoundly changed or they disappear, a person feels torn between hope that things will return to normal and a looming sense that life as they knew is fading away, that it's changed permanently. And this can be really confusing. This kind of loss is confusing. It's difficult to make sense of this kind of loss. A person may be physically present. They might be right in front of you, but emotionally unavailable, or engaging in behaviors that you just don't understand or you don't want for them. This experience may feel like a loss, but it's not readily identified as one, like we've been talking about throughout. Hopes can be raised and destroyed many times. So you start to become numb, unable to react because your hopes have been dashed. You start to feel burnout. And because of that ongoing confusion about the loss, there's also frequent conflicting thoughts and emotions, dread, relief, hope, hopelessness. And that can lead to action or paralysis. We get overwhelmed, we get overtaxed. And people are often frozen in place in their reactions and unable to move forward because of this. And difficulty problem solving in all other areas too. We get, decision fatigue. It can feel completely overwhelming. And there's no associated rituals with this kind of loss. We can't have something definitive, something that we can see, something that others can share in and help us support. They don't know how to deal with that. Like in a death, there's clear ways that we behave. With an ambiguous loss, there's not really a clear way forward. And although there's still hope that things may return to the way that they used to be, we don't know how long that might take. We don't know, if with addiction or with treatment or with therapy or with, how long that will take. There's no set time. And people tend to withdraw instead of offering support others around us because, again, they don't always know how to deal with this. And it can feel pretty overwhelming. It can affect so many areas of our life, not just the relationship that we have. It can affect us personally and professionally. So all of that being said, what do you do with that, right? What do you do with all of that kind of those feelings? Seeking out support is helpful. Identifying it first, understanding what you're feeling is grief is helpful. Validating it, expressing it, talking about the elephant in the room, right? Having these conversations with other people, identifying it, saying, this is grief that I'm feeling. Helping other people identify that can be helpful. Recognizing and naming it, right, is the first step, because we don't even always know what it is. And if we can't name it, it has too much power, right? So if we can name it, sometimes we can seek help. We can seek out support groups, we can seek out other people, we can seek out education and experience, trying to understand that there are many people that have similar losses. There are people out there that we can talk to that can understand it. We can practice acceptance. And acceptance does not mean that you like what's happening or that you even support what's happening. Acceptance is for ourselves, right? It's an active process, so it must be practiced. And every time we practice acceptance, because we cannot control it, we create and strengthen neural pathways in our brain to facilitate a little bit more ease in the future with dealing with this. I wanted to share this. This is a great, simple cartoon. Let me know if you can hear it once I press play. But it's a really nice thing to share with loved ones. It's a really nice thing to remember for ourselves on how to support a grieving friend. And I think, and I hope that we've defined at this point that grief cannot just be around a death, but it can be many things. So how do we support each other? How do we support a friend? How do we seek support for ourselves? And I'll share this.
So, what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary, everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up. But here's what we tend to do instead. "You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them." Or, "You know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off." Or, "I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture?" We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
Okay. So what that was actually from Refuge in Grief. So I wanted to share a couple tools that I found along the way that I found really helpful myself. And Refuge in Grief is one of them, as well as the CDC website that actually has a lot of specific ways to deal with stress, stress that's related to grief. There's also, and I reference this a lot throughout, What's Your Grief is a great website, because again, the focus here isn't always on grief associated with death. There's so much information about grief associated with loss of expectations, grief associated with events, grief associated your non-traditional kind of views around grief. And it's a great website, so I wanted to share that as a resource to explore, as well as Megan Devine, who was just speaking in that video. She wrote a book called "It's Okay That You're Not Okay." And it's also a really helpful tool in sort of understanding that what we feel associated with grief is totally appropriate and normal and acceptable. And there's a lot of information and good resources there, as well as that What's Your Grief. And these are just some of my references. I believe you'll get a slide, access to these slides. So there's lots of information here, different references that I've, different articles and research. Like I said, there's not a whole lot, unfortunately, there's not a ton of research around this specific kind of grief. But the conversations are growing around it, so we're hoping there'll be more. But there is some articles and references throughout these slides that have specific talking about like chronic sorrow and living losses, bereavement as well, but also some other research associated with it. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen now to